Hi, here are alternative ways to organize your essay part 1. Okay, so you're supposed to write something but you don't know where to start. You learned about the 5-paragraph essay in a previous school year, but your crazy teacher this year told you to branch out and get away from that particular template. It feels like traveling without a map, doesn't it? What you want are clear, specific instructions. Let me help you think of it in a different way. Here's where all this is headed. I made up a bunch of models for you to use. This video contains 26 different ways you can organize your essay or blog entry or whatever it is. Part 1 is about informative essays. Part 2 is about persuasive and narrative essays. So you can watch the videos, get some good all-purpose ideas regardless of what kind of essay it is you're writing, take pieces from different examples, and let your mind follow its natural course of thought, depending on what it is you have to say, mixing and matching as you go. And it's absolutely essential that you have something to say. So start there. Be curious, be creative, and keep in mind that these are just hypothetical examples and none of them will fit everything you have to say. Okay, one last thing before I get to the models. Assume that all of these essay models need to begin with some kind of hook that gets your reader's attention and draws them in. You can try Chapter 1 of this excellent book, They Say, I Say, by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein for help with your hook. And all of these models should end with a conclusion that makes clear to your readers why your ideas are important and extends their thinking to the next step. My diagrams will include only the body paragraphs, so just assume there's a hook box above and a conclusion box below all of these examples. I have videos on both of these topics. Kinds of essays. There are as many ways to write an essay as there are ways to cook a meal. It all depends on what ingredients you have, what kind of impact you want to have on the person, what kind of meal it is, and who's eating it. Some teachers call that RAFT, role, audience, format, and topic. I'm going to divide these models into 3 categories: informational, persuasive, and narrative. And just so you know, we're going to zip through these examples pretty fast, so just pause the video if you see something you think you can use. First, let's look at informational essays, sometimes called expository writing. Number 1, problem solving. In this one, a problem is stated, maybe in the form of a question, as in, what can be done to improve race relations today? First, you state the problem clearly so your reader understands what the situation is and why it's important that we find a solution. This is called context. In the next section, you explain a solution someone else has proposed. Always give examples. And even if you disagree with this solution, describe it fairly and impartially. Then do the same with someone else's proposed solution. In the next paragraph or section, you analyze the benefits and drawbacks of each approach. To analyze simply means to look at the separate parts of a thing in order to explain and interpret them. So you do that. Finally, you synthesize those ideas, blending them into your own ideas into a new and better solution. 2. Analysis. I just explained what analysis is in example 1, but in this sort of essay, you describe a person, place, or thing, breaking it down to its component parts and examining them. An analysis could take all sorts of forms, but for example, you might be learning about the human nervous system and its vulnerability to injury. Much of this is just a research report. You explain the workings of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerve fibers throughout the body. In each section, you give illustrative examples. You explain what they mean and cite your sources, like you do in any essay. Now that your reader knows what the nervous system is, though, you can talk about how they work together and how each one can be damaged in everyday situations. You then focus on one that is most common and completely preventable. Maybe that's concussions. Finally, you propose ways to minimize these kinds of injuries. 3. Processes. This is when you explain how a thing is done. As always, assume there's a hook above the top rectangle here, and in this essay, because it is an informative piece, should contain what Dr. Kathleen Rollins at California State University, Northridge calls an umbrella statement, in which you tell your reader right up front what this piece of writing is all about. It's a statement of your topic and is broad enough to cover all of your subtopics. Some folks call it a controlling idea. Your umbrella statement could make clear that you're about to explain how maple syrup is made. This model is sequential, meaning you'll give the steps in the order that you do them. In this example, you'll say the things that you need, the various steps, tapping the tree, collecting the sap, boiling it down. At each step, you could also mention how that particular step has changed over time. Industrial syrup makers today must do that very differently than the early pioneers. Then you might want to say why you might want to make your own maple syrup rather than buy it, and end with a concluding section talking about how this very old process is changing as we move forward into the future. 4. Explore and evaluate. This overlaps quite a bit with the problem-solving essay. In this one, you explore different aspects of a thing and evaluate them. To evaluate means literally to determine the value. So if you were exploring different approaches to restoring dying coral reefs, you'd want to start by explaining what the crisis is. Context again, right? You can't assume your reader already knows about your topic. You look at one approach, then another, pausing to evaluate each one. Eventually, you could focus on one you think could really work and what sorts of obstacles it might face in terms of public opposition. You could conclude by talking about how addressing the effects of climate change is a clear example of right and wrong, and that doing nothing would be very, very wrong. 5. I call this one an if-then chain. That means following a thread of logic down a chain from one proposed idea to its conclusion several steps away. Like, let's say you propose that meat eating is morally indefensible. You could say, if harming an innocent person is morally wrong because people have the right to a reasonable degree of safety, that's A, then that means that safety is a moral right, that's B. If safety is a moral right because harm causes unhappiness and suffering, that's B again, and animals possess most of the qualities that people possess, including the ability to suffer and fear for their safety, then animals have a right to safety as well, that's C, and so on. Along the line, you might want to look at an alternative outcome in the if-then chain, which is a kind of counter-argument. I have a separate video on that topic. Finally, you conclude that your proposition is validated, and you tell your readers to put down that hamburger and hang their heads in shame. 6. Cause and effect. This is similar to the if-then chain, except this time you're showing a chain reaction of one thing causing the next thing. You're showing causal connections. An example of this is arguing that poverty in developing nations indirectly causes oil and food prices to rise in developed nations like the US and Canada. You show that poverty, cause 1, causes political instability, effect 1. In the next step, you show that political instability causes war and civil strife, effect 2. War disrupts the production of oil and other goods, effect 3, which causes everything to get crazy expensive because that's what happens when there's less of a thing that people want. That's your final effect. You go on to briefly look at a couple of ways to address the problem of poverty in developing countries. In the end, maybe in the conclusion, you could talk about why all citizens of the world, regardless of where they live, should care when people they don't see and don't know are barely surviving. 7 is an old form, the comparison essay. Let's say you read 2 plays and your teacher asked you to compare 2 characters, one from each play. Open with your umbrella statement. Since you know you're mainly going to talk about similarities because they're more interesting than the differences, you start by pointing out the obvious differences to give your ideas something to respond to. Then, in contrast with those differences, you write a paragraph each about 3 different similarities between the 2 characters you observed, giving textual evidence and explanations for each one. Finally, maybe you'd write an analysis of how, because of these similarities you've just pointed out, both characters fall into the category of tragic hero, which is a literary archetype that came down to us from the ancient Greeks. But your form will follow whatever your thinking is on your particular topic. 8. Classification. This is where you sort multiple items into separate categories. For example, you could be writing about different kinds of sexual harassment: verbal, physical, and institutional. So then you'd say that in your umbrella statement. You give each one its own paragraph with clear examples and explanations of those examples. At the end, you might focus in on one of the types that is often overlooked and should get more attention than it does. Okay, 9 is fun. Let's call this competing perspectives. It makes me think of an old movie called Rashomon. In this type of essay, you examine how multiple parties view the same event or phenomenon. After your umbrella statement, you could begin with the verifiable facts that are agreed upon by everybody. But in the next section, you get to the fun part. In separate paragraphs or sections, you explain how different people, or maybe groups of people, see the same situation or phenomenon. You'll want to fill these paragraphs with more than just what you imagine these different parties think. Do your research. Give supporting quotes from the text or your research. At the end, you could analyze the different perspectives and say what the similarities and differences suggest. Number 10, oeuvre. Isn't that a cool word? Americans say oeuvre. It means the collection of a writer's or artist's work, looked at all together as one cohesive body of work. You could do this with a playwright, a poet, novelist, or filmmaker. Let's say you saw a consistent thread running through the films of Steven Spielberg. You think his films have a particular way of looking at the world. You describe what that is in one paragraph, then look at that thread in his earliest movies, like Jaws. In the next paragraph, you'd show how that perspective shows up in his mid-career movies, like Jurassic Park and Amistad. You could interrupt your argument here to write about some well-known example that doesn't include this perspective. In that paragraph, you're sort of taking on the perspective of the obnoxious know-it-all who says, yeah, well, what about this one? You could just concede that point. Say, yes, but that's an exception, and that you're talking about an overall trend. Then just move on to show how the perspective you're talking about can still be seen in his most recent movies. 11. Contemporary issue. Begin here with some controversial topic happening now, like all those gut-wrenching YouTube videos of police officers shooting unarmed black people. Describe what's currently going on with this issue. Then say something like, many people have the wrong idea about this issue. They think, and here you summarize their misconception, maybe even quote them from articles you found in your research, and then come back with a clear assertion of what you believe to be the right way to understand the issue. In the middle section of the essay, you could look back in time to explain what the issue has looked like during different times of our history, like slavery and the Jim Crow era. Making sure your reader understands not just what happened, but why it happened. Then revisit that misconception from the beginning of your essay and explain why it's wrong. Finally, at the end, explain how those historical times connect to what is happening today. All right, that's part 1. In part 2, we'll look at models for persuasive and narrative writing.